Justin Trudeau did say that money is no objection to building the treatment center in Grassy Narrows, so I'm going to remind him of that.
Tonight, Grassy Narrows Chief Rudy Turtle on his election run and what the future holds for his community.
If you take out the Indigenous climate portion of it, our numbers are actually higher.
The United Conservative Party releases the Alberta budget.
Well, as women, we're the first teachers to our children. And if we have that cultural knowledge, it's more enriching for our children.
And a community organization in Winnipeg offers traditional teachings.
Good evening, welcome to APTN National News. I'm Dennis Ward.
And I'm Melissa Ridgen. As Chief of Grassy Narrows, Rudy Turtle is still on a quest for justice. Decades of mercury poisoning and subsequent government inaction prompted him to run for a seat in Parliament.
But last week he came up short. Willow Fiddler visited Grassy Narrows to find out what's next for the Ojibwe community.
Turtle says he's holding Justin Trudeau to his word on a promise the Prime Minister made during a leaders' debate.
Justin Trudeau did say that money is no objection to building the treatment center in Grassy Narrows, so I'm going to remind him of that.
In 2017, Indigenous Services Canada promised Grassy Narrows a treatment care facility for those living with mercury poisoning from industrial toxic waste dumped into the river system. But things stalled last summer. Turtle said Indigenous Services Minister Seamus O'Regan showed up in Grassy Narrows last May with his own plan, even though the community already had one.
We have everything done in terms of studies and blueprints and plans and whatever. Like, all that is ready. We just need the government to fund it, and it would mean a lot to the community once we get this going, because it would treat the people who are suffering from mercury poisoning.
Fed up with broken promises, Turtle threw his hat into the ring.
The thing is, NDP has really spoken out for Grassy. Like, we got Charlie Angus, who's been on our side, and Nikki Ashton, and also Jagmeet himself, that they've really took it upon themselves to speak up for Grassy. And so that's why I was leaning more towards them, because they've been helping us a lot.
But he came up short, losing to 21-year-old Conservative candidate Eric Melillo. The day after the election, Melillo met with Turtle and calls him a champion of his community.
And I think it's important in this parliament, in a minority situation, that we have a representative who's going to work across party lines and work together to be able to achieve the goals that we have.
Melillo says he will advocate for Grassy Narrows,
ensuring that we have the proper funding for the right sort of treatment center in Grassy Narrows, and of course we look at many more, whether it's a First Nation community or municipality.
At a press conference in Toronto Monday, Turtle restated his call for Trudeau to make good on his word. He was joined by the sons of former Grassy Narrows Chief Simon Fobister, who died in August, and community elder Bill Fobister. They say the treatment center would not only provide health care, but could lead the country in studies and research of mercury effects.
So with having a home in our community would be ideal, because we would be able to help and be with our family who are contaminated by mercury poisoning.
Turtle says he's optimistic about working with Melillo. For Melillo's part, he plans to visit Grassy Narrows in the coming weeks. On Tuesday, the Prime Minister's office and Indigenous Services Canada told APTN they are committed to building a mercury treatment facility for the community. Willow Fiddler, APTN National News, Thunder Bay.
Alberta's United Conservative Party unveiled their 2019-2020 budget last week. Former Indigenous Relations Minister Richard Feehan criticized the budget, saying that Indigenous communities across Alberta will be receiving less money. Chris Stewart has more.
The United Conservative Party delayed releasing their first budget until after the federal election. It was finally unveiled on Thursday. Albertans will face tax hikes all around except corporations, which will see taxes go down. Former NDP Indigenous Affairs Minister Richard Feehan was very critical about cuts to Indigenous communities. The $57 million Alberta Indigenous Climate Leadership Program was completely axed. The program was created to help Indigenous communities develop renewable energy. Feehan says it was a successful program.
More than 30 community groups, First Nations, Métis, Friendship Centers, put up solar panels in the last few years under that program. So when you see a community who says a program is successful by actually engaging in it and doing the things that result in good things for the community, then you know that that's a program worth keeping, and they just got rid of it. 100% gone.
Current Conservative Indigenous Relations Minister Rick Wilson says because the government cut out the carbon tax, there was no money for the program.
Like when I went out this summer talking to different stakeholders, I heard a lot that they're looking for a hand up, not a handout. And those initiatives were more of a handout, and so what we're looking at doing is real, what my good friend Grand Chief Willie Littlechild calls reconciliation, not reconciliation. He says, Rick, I want you to look at reconciliation.
For him to say that somehow that this was a handout, as opposed to a program of preservation of the environment, is appalling to me. As minister, he should be talking to and listening to the Indigenous communities all across this province. I suggest he go out and actually visit them, because when I went door to door and I talked to people, they talked always about the land. They talked about how important the land is to them and why they want to preserve it so that they can pass it on.
Feehan says that funding for Indigenous communities across Alberta will drop by over 1/3. Minister Wilson disputes that claim.
If you take out the Indigenous climate portion of it, our numbers are actually higher. We've got some increases, some of it through the FNDF, the First Nations Development Fund, and also we've lobbied hard, and we've got some extra money from the feds for employment, another $1.2 million there.
Wilton Littlechild, Grand Chief of the Confederacy of Treaty 6 First Nations, says he's hopeful the Alberta government will replace the Climate Leadership Program with something similar. He wants a sit-down with both Feehan and Minister Wilson.
I know that there was some training that had to be undertaken by our own people to get themselves into a sort of a capacity building as well. And now if that's gone, what do they do? You know, in terms of, do they seek other jobs? There's questions there that I want to raise. I want to have clarification. But I think ideally, if I could sit with both of them at the same time, I think that would be the best.
Littlechild says he believes a meeting can happen in the near future, and he is hoping to get answers and solutions. Chris Stewart, APTN National News, Edmonton.
Well, we'd like to hear what you think. Here's how to continue the conversation. Send your emails to news@aptn.ca. Find us online at aptnnews.ca and on youtube.com/aptn news. You can also follow us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram for the latest Indigenous news.
Police have made an arrest in the case of an Indigenous woman who was found dead near Miramichi, New Brunswick last year. The man police believe killed Candace Stevens is dead, and a 42-year-old Moncton woman has been charged in connection with the homicide. RCMP officers found the 31-year-old's remains last October in Upper Derby, New Brunswick. On Monday, Fredericton police announced they have charged Wendy Gale Loescher with accessory after the fact to murder and for improperly interfering with a dead body. Police say Stevens' alleged killer, James Curtis, is dead, though they have not said how or when he died. Loescher was arrested Friday and appeared in court Monday. Her next hearing is scheduled for November 12th. Her charges carry a maximum sentence of life in prison.
Award-winning musician and activist Jeremy Dutcher is our guest on a new episode of Face to Face tonight, right after the news. Dutcher is also known for speaking up on political issues and for LGBTQ2S+ rights.
It's something that I didn't really have, you know, as a young person in the media landscape, growing up, having somebody who was both Indigenous and queer. So for me, that's a very important space to take up. Yeah. And, you know, just to let young people know that if you are experiencing homophobia or transphobia in your community, that is not us. All of those lessons that were learned from that Christian church, those were coming from outside.
What if Canada actually just gave land back to Indigenous people? A new report explores just that.
It's coming up after the break, but first, here's tomorrow's weather forecast. Starting out on the east coast, sunny and 14 for Charlottetown, partly cloudy and 14 in Fredericton. 6 with rain in Nain, 11 with showers for Happy Valley, Goose Bay, 15 and showers for Montreal, 2 in Chibougamau with snow, 10 with rain for Peterborough, Toronto, London, and Sarnia. 0 under sunny skies in Thunder Bay, -3 with snow for Sioux Lookout. -3 and snow for Puckatawagan and God's Lake, 0 in Churchill. -3 under sunny skies for Winnipeg, Brandon, and Dauphin. In Saskatchewan, -5 and sunny for Regina and Yorkton, snow and -5 in Estevan. -2 in Meadow Lake, -3 with rain in La Ronge. Welcome back. It's a frequent demand by Indigenous peoples, give us our land back. But in an era of reconciliation, Canadian governments have been slow to respond. An Indigenous-led think tank explores this issue in a newly released report. Inspired by a 1970 report by Harold Cardinal, the Yellowhead Institute published the Red Paper, Land Back. To talk more about it, we're joined by Sri Pasternak, Research Director of the Institute. Sure, thanks for joining us. Can you tell us a bit about what the Red Paper Land Back is and why Yellowhead released it?
Yeah, of course. The Red Paper, it's our first Red Paper ever released, our inaugural Red Paper, and it's called Land Back. So we went right to the heart of the issue, and the paper is about how Canada dispossesses Indigenous people with a particular focus on First Nations of their lands, and in turn what Indigenous communities are doing to get that land back.
So, Sherry, despite Supreme Court victories like Chilcotin, the report points out that courts still favor government when it comes to conflict over land and resource development. Can you explain a little further?
Sure. Well, our report does do an overview of some of the big court cases being played out around Aboriginal rights and title, but I think one of the research findings that's really original that we produced in our report was an overview of injunctions being filed for by and against First Nations across the country. It's the first time anyone's ever tried to gauge what the situation is when resource conflicts end up in the courts through injunctions. And we found that overwhelmingly the courts decide in favor of companies and governments against Indigenous people in the case of resource conflicts. I think this is really significant because, first of all, injunctions do not allow for the court to appraise the full strength of claim of Indigenous people. They basically only have the tools to determine basically who has more significant economic loss, whose balance of convenience is more inconvenienced. And so with those very sort of basic tools, the courts tend to choose corporations because they can prove quantitatively that they're losing profits, whereas when Indigenous people point to their economic livelihoods based on their territories and waters, it's less persuasive for the courts.
How do the Crown and industry continue to dispossess Indigenous peoples from their land?
Well, we look at a range of forms of dispossession on a spectrum. So under the sort of form of dispossession that we call denial, we go right back to the doctrines of discovery and look at the whole concept of Crown land and the fact that Canada claims underlying title to all lands in this country as a basic form, as the first form and the foundational form of dispossession, because what the government is essentially saying is that they don't recognize any forms of Indigenous proprietary interest or jurisdiction, and the legal orders of governance that govern the lands. They don't recognize that at all. And so denial is the first form of dispossession, and it plays out in the way that Crown lands then use that underlying title to authorize all kinds of development, permitting, licensing, leasing, to do forestry, mining, hydro development, and so on. And in this way, it dispossesses Indigenous people over in their ability to exercise jurisdiction on the land. But then we also look at different kinds of dispossession that we call recognition, where there's some recognition of Aboriginal rights, for example, through the duty to consult, that allow Indigenous people to exercise some measure of jurisdiction, for example, through resource revenue sharing agreements, either with private companies or with provinces and territorial governments, or with industry directly. But we argue that these are weaker forms of jurisdiction for a number of reasons. One is that they don't really give Indigenous people the right to determine whether or not they want to authorize that development. A lot of the sharing happens after the provinces already issue the permits, for example. And negotiating Aboriginal rights through these private legal contracts also leaves a lot to be desired. The legal contracts don't have the same kind of standing as court cases determined on through the Supreme Court of Canada or through international principles like free, prior, and informed consent. And so they're limited in their capacity to protect Indigenous land rights as well. They don't, for example, protect the proper title and rights holders as the decision makers.
So what are the consequences if nothing is done?
If the land isn't given back?
Right.
Well, we look at all kinds of models of reclamation that are happening across the country that give us a sense of what the potential is if land restitution were to take place in a meaningful way. And they're incredible stories that really, first of all, speak to the importance of Indigenous knowledge and law in protecting the land. In particular, we put this in a context of the climate crisis and look at how projects to restore governance, for example, over fisheries, over water bases, over everything from, the highest level of land management to smaller practices like control over permitting for mushroom picking, for example, in Tsilhqot'in territory. We look at the possibilities of what this country could look like if Indigenous people could exercise their jurisdiction without constant interruption by the federal and provincial governments.
Sherry, we'll have to leave it there, but appreciate you joining us, and thanks for your work on this paper.
Thanks very much for having me.
We've got to take a quick break, but when we come back, we visit a century-old cultural hub to find out what's new.
First, here's the rest of Wednesday's weather forecast.
Picking back up in northern Alberta, 7 with snow for high level, +2 in snow for Fort McMurray. Sunny and 1 in Medicine Hat, +6 and sunny in Calgary and Edmonton. Sunny on the west coast, 8 for Vancouver and Victoria. +7 in Fort Nelson under sunny skies, 2 above in Dease Lake with snow. 0 in snow in Old Crow and Watson Lake, +3 in Whitehorse. 8 with showers for Fort Liard and Trout Lake, -1 in Norman Wells. 0 for Sax Harbor and Colville Lake, +4 in Pawlatuck. -11 in Baker Lake, -2 with snow for Cambridge Bay. -10 in snow for Resolute and Arctic Bay.
Welcome back. It's an organization that's been around for over a century and teaches everything from film to art to language. It's a place to reconnect with your culture in urban Winnipeg landscape. APTN's Jolene Banning went to see what's new in this old Winnipeg mainstay.
New Directions has been around since 1885. It was created to foster hope, aid in the well-being of the community, and honor the strengths of our people. The organization takes a holistic approach to achieving that and calls on local artists and cultural knowledge keepers like Chickadee Richard from Sandy Bay Ojibwe First Nation.
Well, as women, we're the first teachers to our children. And if we have that cultural knowledge, it's more enriching for our children, and our children become more proud and stronger in who they are.
She shares her knowledge of protocols, songs, and ceremonies.
We want that balance back. We want our role to be honored as women.
Darlene Daniels is the Senior Director of New Directions, in charge of culture, education, and training. The education offered is more than Western education. There's education around traditional parenting, Anishinaabe cooking and art, from sewing regalia to the porcupine roach to life-size murals.
We've done several different murals with different teachings around the truth and reconciliation.
Participants were partnered with established mural artists, and ideas were hashed out around the 7 sacred teachings, language, and parenting. One participant wanted to create something she didn't often see in mainstream society, an Indigenous female superhero who looked out for all nations, including LGBTQ2S, who wasn't afraid to show her true colors.
I had people to look up to, and I want other kids to have something to look up to and be proud of who they are.
Darlene Daniels says this is where the magic happens. New Directions has produced fluent speakers in Anishinaabe film producers, published poets, and star blanket sewers. Children of all ages are welcome to learn their language, legends, traditions, and culture. Jolene Banning, APTN National News, Winnipeg.
The path to recovery for those dealing with opioid addiction can be a difficult one. A program being offered at Atches for Indigenous adults is trying to make that path a little easier to walk through culturally focused healing. CTV's Aaron Mahoney reports.
Jerry Firth is the manager of a Lethbridge program that uses culture to help people overcome addictions. Speaking at a meeting of the Southern Alberta Council on Public Affairs, Firth says the Arches Recovery Coach program is aimed at helping Indigenous adults undergoing medically assisted treatment for opioid addiction. The program came about after the Lethbridge Indigenous Sharing Network brought forward the concept a few years back.
And had approached Arches to implement it as a local organization. And the intention of that was to address the impact of the opioid crisis within the urban Indigenous community.
It focuses on working with participants from a person-centered approach to help them resolve any issues or problems that can impact their recovery, and is now just over a year old.
We have it designed in a way that over the first 3 years we kind of make amendments and changes as we go along year after year so that we can develop the program.
An Indigenous recovery coach functions similarly to any other recovery coach, but the difference in the approach is how they process things through a cultural lens. The program is unique not just to Alberta, but to all of Canada. So far, things have been pretty successful, but coaches do stress that each individual is different.
And it's going to be a hit and miss, though, definitely, especially within this first year. But we have had successes along the way, and it could be something very minor for that individual.
Blood says their expectations aren't for clients to climb Mount Everest, but are based on where a person is at and trying to provide the support and encouragement they need. Recovery coaches try to support participants through all stages of recovery, and they hope in the future they'll be able to extend the program beyond city limits.
We're trying our best to work not only with the people here in the city, but when making sure that the services that we're providing follow them out onto the reserve. So that's just all about networking and building up those relationships.
Aaron Mahoney, CTV News, Lethbridge.
Nice program.
Yeah.
That's your APTN National News for this Tuesday. For news anytime, visit our website, aptnnews.ca.
And join us live at 3 p.m. Eastern Time tomorrow as we put tricksters and shapeshifters and other mythical creatures in focus just in time for Halloween. I'm Melissa Ridgen. Thanks for tuning in.
And I'm Dennis Ward. Stick around. Face to Face with guest Jeremy Dutcher is next. Have a great night. See you back here tomorrow.